Let's look at this painting. The title of this painting is Hapag ng Pag-asa, or Table of Hope, by a Filipino painter, Joey Velasco. His painting has Jesus eating with 12 children at risk in Manila. These are real kids from the streets of Manila, Philippines. Itok, Nene, Joyce, Tinay, Emong, Once, Buknoy, Michael, Dodoy, June, and Rosel. As we look at this painting, reflect on your definition of children at risk. What is your description of children at risk in your context? I want to show this video to give you an example of the kind of trauma that some children in the Philippines are currently experiencing. Just a warning, this may trigger emotional and physical reactions, so it will be helpful to make our group as a safe space or safe community to debrief and talk about your feelings and reactions after seeing this video.
Magbaba daw ako, at saka magbukaka daw ako, at saka igaganon ko lang sarili ko. Maputi lang po siya pero may balibo siya. Simula po ako sa show na 7 years old. Tatlo lang. Ako lang po ang binili ko ng pagkain. 300 yun. Hindi yun alam ni mama ko. Nagagalit po ako at saka gusto ko nang kalimutan. Ayoko po yun. No. Talagang nami-miss ko talaga mama ko. Ay, pamilya. Dinalaw na po ako nung dati. Sana po madalaw na kami at saka makasama ko na pamilya ko. Magbuo na kami lahat. Sayaw, mag-aral po at saka kumanta. Ang na-wish ko po, magiging singer at saka gustong matapos yung aral. Yun po, gusto ko nang matuto lahat. Yun po, yun lang po.
Let's talk about why we invest time in learning about trauma. Trauma is an important topic because many people have lived through it. People carry these traumas with them in their minds and bodies. Trauma affects a person's behavior, feelings, relationships, and view of the world in profound and sometimes confusing ways. Other people's trauma affects us as service providers or ministry practitioners. And when we understand trauma and how it impacts people, it becomes easier to communicate with survivors of trauma, to improve survivors' behaviors and attitudes, get survivors the help that they need, and reduce your own risk as ministry practitioners of being negatively impacted by others' trauma. Now we proceed to talking about trauma itself. When you think about the word trauma, what comes to mind? What does that word mean to you? A trauma is an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. What you heard me say as part of the definition were three things: events and circumstances, individual's experience, and effects. Let's talk more about what we mean. Events and circumstances involves actual or extreme threats of physical or psychological harm. Sometimes are individual events or happen repeatedly over time. Individual's experience. An event that is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another. The experience is shaped by a number of factors, including cultural beliefs, availability of a positive support system, developmental stage, and emotions experienced during the events. Effects. Impact of trauma can be immediate or delayed in their onset. They can last a long time or a very short time. Examples of effects of trauma can be behavioral, like hyperarousal, avoidance, or they can be physical, changes to the person's brain. It's important to understand the effects of trauma because these are often what we as ministry practitioners encounter when working with them. So now that we know what trauma is, let us talk about specific examples of trauma. What are some examples of trauma based on the definition we gave? There are many different types and examples of trauma: sexual abuse or rape, physical abuse, natural disaster, floods, typhoons, earthquakes, fires, traumatic loss, like sudden or violent death of a loved one, serious accidents like car accident, bus, or boat, violent crimes like robbery or kidnapping, witnessing violence, domestic, like street gangs, trafficking in persons, like forced labor, commercial and sexual exploitation, poverty, neglect, medical procedures, or are there other kinds of trauma that you can think of? Since all of us are in children's ministry, we need to know the impact of trauma on children. Trauma overwhelms the child. It disrupts stability of the child's inner world. The child is unable to cope. Coping with the trauma consumes the child's energy. It robs the child of the energy needed for normal development. How do we identify trauma in children? A child exhibits extreme stress, intense fear, horror, or disorganized behavior, flashbacks, avoiding cues associated with the trauma, persistent oversensitivity or overarousal. The signs can be present for over a month, and significant disturbances in functioning like repetitive behaviors, self-mutilation, depression, weight loss, inability to concentrate, hyperactivity, disturbed sleep, irritability, and failure to thrive. In the groundbreaking book, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman, she explains that traumatic events render victims helpless by overwhelming force, involves threat to life or bodily integrity, or close personal encounter with violence and death, disrupt a sense of control, connection, and meaning, confront human beings with extremities of helplessness and terror, and evoke the responses of catastrophe. Thus can trauma shape a survivor's basic beliefs about identity, worldview, and spirituality. Often, survivors begin asking themselves or others questions like, am I a bad person? Will I be able to trust anyone again? Is the world a safe place? Why did God allow this to happen? But people are very resilient. By using a trauma-informed approach, the effects of trauma can be addressed and a person can go on to lead a normal life. This is of critical importance because, unfortunately, traumatic events are not beyond the scope of normal human experience. They are not rare. In Metro Manila, Philippines, 75 of the men and women surveyed had at least one exposure to an adverse childhood experience. This means that when gathering groups of people in Manila, two-thirds of people would have experienced some form of trauma. In the general population in the United States, 61% of men and 51% of women reported exposure to at least one lifetime traumatic event, but majority reporting more than one traumatic event. This means, in the US, if you gather a group of people together, over half of them will have experienced trauma at some point in their life. Many of us have our own experience we bring to our roles as ministry practitioners, pastors, which is something to pay attention to notice how our own experiences have shaped us and our interactions with survivors. And these traumas are not without impact. There are extensive emotional and cognitive repercussions. Traumatized children learn some of this coping or defense mechanism. Denial. Act as though stress doesn't exist. Use fantasy to deny reality. Regression. Act younger than actual age, dependent and demanding. Withdrawal. Remove self mentally or physically. Impulsive acting out. Conceal hurt by making others angry at them or self-destructive. The impact of trauma and stress on child development is that a child needs to encounter new experiences from a secure foundation. They need to match between experiences and the child's capacity. But too much stress can change the brain structure of a child. What we want from this is to simply see the trauma has an impact beyond what we can see, but that is significant in the life of a child or a survivor of trauma. To help us understand the prevalence of trauma and its impact, let's talk about a study conducted in Metro Manila in 2007. The study, called the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE or ACE study, set out to look at the connection between adverse childhood experience such as physical abuse, neglect, sexual assault, to health risk behaviors such as smoking, excessive drinking, suicide attempts, risky sexual behavior, and chronic disease conditions in adult life such as diabetes and heart disease. In Metro Manila, the study considered of a random sample of 535 males and 533 females, aged 36 years old and older, living in barangays of Quezon City, people from different socioeconomic background. The researchers used the tool called ACE or ACE questionnaire, originally developed in the United States but translated in Filipino. This is an example of the ACE or the ACE questionnaire, and you may read through it and reflect your personal adverse childhood experience by answering this questionnaire. So the findings of the ACE study are this. Adverse childhood experiences, traumas, can lead to disrupted brain development. Disrupted brain development can lead to social, emotional, or cognitive impairments. These impairments can lead to people to make poor decisions and engaging in high-risk behaviors, substance use, risky sex, and self-harm. High-risk behaviors can have undesired consequences of disease, such as heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic illness and other problems. These problems can lead to early death. We've discussed that the impact of trauma is far-reaching. It has the power to alter our lives, particularly in cases of prolonged and repeated trauma. Trauma can cause new challenges or make familiar problems worse. As we mentioned previously, it impacts our very beliefs about our identity, our worldview, and spirituality. It can even change the way our brain works. Recognizing the impact of trauma changes the question from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. It helps us recognize how a survivor or a child experience impacts the choices make and the behaviors she or he displays. Here are some ways adults can support children survivors of trauma. Adult support can be children need support of at least one caring adult. Intervention strategy questions would be how to reduce stress through environmental changes, or change the attitude or behaviors of significant adults. Modify child's extreme behavior into better coping responses. Help the child to adjust perception of self and or the situation. We can also place the child in familiar contexts. A secure, nurturing environment consistent with social, cultural values promotes faster healing. Disruption of support, like war or disaster, makes this difficult. Unaccompanied, traumatized children are the most vulnerable. We can also consider contextually sensitive responses. Family and community should be maintained if all possible. Stability, continuity, and tradition. Culturally appropriate supports, continuing of rituals, celebrations, cultural practices for maintaining a child's identity, or capitalizing on strength and supports that are available. We can promote the resilience within the child or within the environment. And we can equip the child with skills. No one has all the assets, but the more, the better.